welcome everybody to JDG on Halloween. We have a very interesting paper here today by Cathy Mason called The Epistemic Demands of Friendship. I don't think it has anything to do with Halloween, but we'll see.
Thank you. Great. So in the recent literature on friendship, epistemic partialism, which is the view that ethical norms and epistemic norms conflict, has been popular. And in particular, the suggestion has been that ethical norms deriving from valuable relationships like friendship sometimes demand things that conflict with epistemic demands on us. I take it that it would be quite disconcerting if there were this kind of conflict between friendship and epistemic norms. This kind of conflict would imply that in acting well in one regard, so as a friend or as an epistemic agent, we can be systematically precluded from acting well in another regard, as an epistemic agent or as a friend. The thought would be that there's no way of getting it right overall. It's impossible in some circumstances, or impossible, say, to be both a good friend and a responsible epistemic agent. So in response to this pessimistic thought, lots of philosophers who are skeptical about epistemic partiality have sought to find ways of understanding the demands of friendship and epistemic agency so that they're consistent. So usually they've sought to suggest that both epistemic norms are less restrictive than people assume, and that friendship is less demanding than epistemic partialists think. And these kind of skeptics about epistemic partiality conclude that epistemic norms permit the doxastic states or actions characteristic of friendship, and that friendship then fortuitously turns out not to require anything epistemically dubious after all. In this talk, I'm going to be exploring an alternative response to epistemic partialism that's inspired by Iris Murdoch's work on love and knowledge. So on Murdoch's view, love is, or at least involves, knowledge of the individual, such that to fail to see the beloved truly isn't only an epistemic failure, but it's also a failure of love. So on her view, insofar as one's knowledge of the other is lacking, so too is one's love of them. Given the plausible assumption that friendship involves love, then a Murdochian view of friendship will imply that the person who fails to see their friend as they truly are, far from being a good friend, necessarily falls short of the intrinsic demands of friendship. So I'll be suggesting that a Murdochian view of friendship provides a novel way of rejecting epistemic partialism. And I'll then suggest that a Murdochian view of friendship isn't merely of exegetical interest. I want to suggest that it casts light on some quite important intuitions about friendship. So I'll be arguing that there's reason to take this view of friendship seriously and think that these discussions have gone awry. So firstly, I'm going to outline why ethical norms concerning friendship are taken by epistemic partialists to conflict with epistemic norms. And then I'll say that underlying the appeal of this thought is the assumption that good friendship is independent of epistemic goods. I'll then argue that Murdoch's work provides a novel way of responding to this problem by insisting that these two aren't independent after all, that friendship involves epistemic goods, thus ruling out the possibility of constitutive conflict. And finally, I'll suggest that this Murdoch-inspired response makes good sense of some important intuitions that we have about friendship. So firstly, an outline of epistemic partialism. At any one point, humans are going to be subject to all sorts of different norms. So we're subject to epistemic norms, prudential norms, moral norms, social norms, all of this kind of thing. And these norms sometimes come into conflict. Some conflicts between two kinds of norm are going to be merely coincidental. They arise simply because of the particular circumstances in which you find yourself. So in a case that's been much discussed, if somebody promises to greatly financially reward you for believing something kind of utterly trivial but patently untrue, then in that particular instance it seems like what you prudentially ought to do and what you epistemically ought to do come into conflict. This kind of conflict of demands is of course going to be unfortunate, but it doesn't indicate any deep-seated or inherent conflict between the two kinds of norm. Epistemic norms and the norms of friendship can clearly conflict in this coincidental sense. So you might have epistemic reason to clear up your confusion on some issue, since doing so would maximise your true beliefs or something, but also a reason of friendship to take time to go and see a friend. This kind of conflict isn't going to indicate that there's any constitutive conflict between the norms of friendship and epistemology. The controversial claim put forward by epistemic partialists is that there's an inherent or a constitutive conflict between the norms of friendship and epistemology. So their claim is that being a good friend is partially constituted by forming positive beliefs about one's friends or by adopting belief-forming strategies that are likely to lead to such positive beliefs. So in other words, they suggest that being a good friend can be partially constituted by biased beliefs or biased belief-forming mechanisms that are kind of resistant to any negative evidence that's out there. On the other hand, epistemic norms seem to suggest that you should form beliefs on the basis of considerations that bear on epistemic goals, so on goals like the truth of the claim in question or one's knowledge. Such beliefs or belief-forming mechanisms are by definition unbiased. So the potential conflict between the demands of friendship and epistemic demands suggests is thus no mere coincidence, but inherent to the very nature of those norms themselves. So these prescribe things that are incompatible, since one kind of norm, the norms of friendship, demands bias, and the other, and epistemic norms, prohibit it. So Sarah Stroud claims, and this is on the handout, friendship constitutively involves belief-forming practices which are irrational or otherwise objectionable by the light of mainstream epistemologies. So to kind of motivate this, Stroud notes that friendship is often thought to be in some sense based on your kind of view of your friend's character and their merits, and she says it kind of makes sense then that we need, as it were, to maintain a favourable opinion of our friend's character. So if we're friends with people, if being friends with people involves regarding them highly, then she thinks, well, being a good friend perhaps involves continuing to regard them highly. And that can sometimes mean being resistant to evidence. Keller has a slightly different way of motivating this. He says being a good friend involves lots of things like support and encouragement, and we get those if our friends have a positive view of us. So it's important to note that they both suggest that it's the friendship itself that's giving us reasons to form either positive beliefs or positive belief-forming practices here, even though in reality there's always likely to be a kind of epistemic explanation. You know, we're going to know more about people who are friends, but they think even setting that aside, friendship itself is going to give us this kind of reason. So her view isn't that we kind of just that we form friendships with people we like or admire, but also that friendship itself requires of us that we form these positive beliefs or be disposed to form them. So to illustrate what epistemic partiality might require, Simon Keller puts forward the following example. He says, Rebecca's scheduled to give a poetry reading at a cafe and has invited her friend Eric along. Having attended lots of these readings, Eric's accumulated strong reasons to believe that the poetry is never more than mediocre and usually positively bad. So Keller suggests that prior to knowing who will be performing, Eric would have very good evidence for the belief that their poetry will be unimpressive. And were Eric assessing the likelihood that a stranger would give a good poetry reading, Keller claims that he ought to believe that they won't, since he's got plenty of evidence for this conclusion. But Keller suggests that Eric ought not to form this belief about Rebecca's poetry, despite having no extra knowledge of her aesthetic capacities or anything similar that might count as evidence for that belief. He just says that as a friend, it's his role to support and encourage her, and so he ought not to believe that Rebecca's poetry will be bad. So just to flag, there are going to be two kind of varieties of epistemic partialism. Direct epistemic partialism is going to be the claim that friendship provides direct reasons for belief. Keller seems to often suggest this. And indirect epistemic partialism, which will be the claim that friendship provides reasons to cultivate doxastic dispositions that will in turn yield beliefs about one's friend that are positive. But for the purposes of what I'm saying, it shouldn't matter too much about this because on either version, these kinds of reasons will clash with epistemic reasons, which have to do with epistemic goods like evidence, truth, knowledge. So, onto the independence assumption. The idea that the norms of friendship could constitutively conflict with epistemic norms in either of these ways depends on the assumption that the norms of friendship are inherently independent of epistemic norms. And this assumption is necessary if there's going to be constitutive as opposed to merely coincidental tension between the two. That is, friendship is only going to constitutively demand things that are inconsistent with epistemic demands if friendship isn't itself knowledge involving. If good friendship involves knowledge or a propensity towards such knowledge, then the demands of friendship would themselves involve epistemic demands and so can constitutively conflict with them. Keller explicitly agrees with this, and he draws a comparison here between reasons that are given by friendship or epistemology and those of tastiness and healthiness. So in the long quote on the handout, he notes that foods aren't tasty in virtue of their healthiness, nor are they healthy in virtue of their tastiness. Healthiness as such doesn't contribute to tastiness, nor vice versa. And he says so it's possible for the two considerations to come apart in inconsistent directions. And Keller's suggestion here is that, like the tastiness and healthiness of food, epistemic norms and those of friendship are just unconnected. So it's unsurprising that they should pull apart. The two kinds of norm, like healthiness and tastiness, are independent of one another, and so any coincidence is going to be kind of fortuitous, as in cases where some healthy foods are also tasty. So his suggestion is that knowledge, as such, doesn't contribute to friendship, so there's no reason to expect epistemic demands to coincide with those of friendship or to be consistent with those of friendship. This claim that friendship is independent of epistemic goods has generally gone unquestioned. So that's why those philosophers who are sceptical about the idea that we should be epistemically partial to our friends have raised no challenge to the idea that norms of friendship are inherently independent of epistemic norms. That's why instead they suggest that friendship just doesn't require quite as much of us as partialists assume, and that epistemic norms are less restrictive than might be thought. So they think it might be fortuitous, but both demands are kind of lower or something than you might think, or vaguer or more flexible. So I'll be suggesting that the norms of friendship aren't independent of those of epistemology, but that doesn't necessarily entail kind of rejecting the approaches to rejecting epistemic partiality that have been suggested. Rather, the kind of account I'm giving, I think, is going to provide an explanation of why the particular demands of friendship turn out so fortuitously to be consistent with those of epistemology. So although the assumption that the norms of friendship are inherently independent of epistemic norms is very widely taken for granted, I think there's good reason to be hesitant about accepting it. Because on some plausible conceptions of friendship, the norms of friendship and epistemic agency are going to be very closely related. And if you think that friendship involves or is partially constituted by love, then the Murdochian conception is going to be one such account. So on Murdoch's account of love, love isn't something whose demands or norms could be in constitutive conflict with epistemic norms or not. And that's because love, as she conceives of it, is an epistemic rich state. Love is partly constituted by epistemic goods like knowledge. Thus, on the assumption that friendship is partly constituted by love, a Murdochian conception of friendship will entail that friendship, too, is partly constituted by epistemic goods like knowledge. So on Keller's conception that I mentioned earlier, friendship is going to fundamentally involve goods like support and encouragement, reassurance that someone's on your side, and he thinks none of these involve any epistemic goods. But Murdoch, on the other hand, conceives of love and hence friendship as having an inherently epistemic dimension. So she says, and these are on the handout, love is the perception of individuals. Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Love is the discovery of reality. and elsewhere, love is knowledge of the individual. So these suggest that Murdoch's thinking of love as very different to realising certain goods like assurance or support. On her conception, love is going to involve a kind of knowledge or perception, where these sound very much like factive states. On her account then, love isn't going to be simply a matter of acting in a certain way or feeling a certain way, but something that inherently involves epistemic goods. Murdoch associates love with a certain kind of open-endedness in one's vision of an object. Love, as she conceives of it, involves not just a kind of static set of something like true beliefs about the other, but a movement towards a deeper and a truer knowledge of the other. So the lover, she says, is confronted with an endless task, an ideal limit of love or knowledge which always recedes. So the person who attends to some object with love, on Murdoch's conception, is continuously involved in a progression towards an understanding of the object that does greater and greater justice to it. So Murdoch's discussing love in general rather than friendship in particular, and she conceives of it in a very broad sense. So I don't think her general view of love is going to tell us all that there is to know about friendship, but it does seem like love is plausibly necessary for and a central aspect of friendship. And that seems true certainly for the kinds of friendship that are deep and important, which are precisely the cases that epistemic partialists think are candidates for influencing our epistemic obligations. So epistemic partialists don't generally think that we need to have a positive view of every friend or every person who's a friendly acquaintance, but they think the deep and important friendships are the cases where we might have this duty to view them in a positive light. So if we think that in these cases, these deep and important cases, friendship involves love, any feature of love will thereby be a feature of friendship, even if it doesn't tell us all that there is to know about it. So on Murdoch's conception, to love someone involves knowing who they are as a person. Not all knowledge about another person will matter for friendship, so knowing the exact time that a friend's bus leaves for work seems irrelevant, but knowledge of a friend's character traits, their deeply held beliefs, their values, that kind of thing, is going to plausibly contribute to one's knowledge of them as a person. And it's knowledge of precisely these kinds of things that epistemic partialists suggest should be influenced by friendship. So the assumption that the norms of friendship and epistemic norms are inherently independent of one another is thereby precluded by a Murdochian account of love. The Murdochian account is going to imply that the demands of love, and thereby of friendship, couldn't constitutively conflict with epistemic demands, because knowledge and the deepening of such knowledge is an integral aspect of friendship. So if the Murdochian view is right, the parallel Keller draws concerning the independence of considerations of tastiness and healthiness is going to be mistaken. Instead, friendship and epistemic considerations are going to be related to something more like tastiness and texture. While tastiness isn't identical to good texture, plausibly good texture contributes to tastiness. So on the Murdochian account, forming unjustified or inaccurate beliefs about a friend's character would detract from one's attempts to be a good friend, since forming epistemically unjustified beliefs about who someone is a bad way to try to gain knowledge of the other person, and since on the Murdochian account friendship involves such knowledge, it would be a bad way to try to be a good friend. So on this kind of view, it couldn't possibly be a requirement of friendship that one form beliefs or belief-forming dispositions about the character of one's friends in an epistemically questionable manner. So this conception of friendship is going to rule out both direct and indirect epistemic partiality. Which of course brings us to the question of whether we should accept this conception of friendship. I think it's going to gain some kind of intuitive support from the idea that if you have sufficiently mistaken beliefs about the other, you fail to relate to them. So if I claim to love you and yet find that my beliefs about you are radically mistaken, it seems plausible to think that I wasn't really relating to you at all. Rather, I'm loving this illusion, this person I thought existed, but who never in fact really did. I therefore seem to fail to relate to you as an individual in the way that would be required for a true friendship. Insofar as the person I believe myself to love doesn't correspond to the actual person confronting me, then I'm not loving them, or at least not as well as I should. So to kind of illustrate this, think of Dorothea Brooke's feelings of love for Edward Casaubon in Middlemarch. At the beginning of the novel, the young Dorothea believes herself to love Edward. She trusts him, she makes plans with him, she holds him in very high esteem. But despite this, it would seem really odd to say that she ever truly loves him, and this is largely because she's just radically mistaken about who she is. So she conceives of him as this genius, and she loves him as such. But he turns out to be utterly unlike her vision of him. And she later comes to realise that he's dry and narrow-minded, pedantic, and that he has pitifully little to show for his life's work. In the early period, Dorothea fails to see Edward as he truly is, instead creating this stereotyped image of a kind of solitary genius with very little correlation to reality. And in loving this mere fantasy, it seems like Dorothea fails to love Edward himself. Her failure to know him, a failure for which he is of course largely responsible, seems to indicate a failure to love him. So the Murdochian account of friendship is going to enable us to say that Dorothea's love for Edward is deeply deficient, gone awry somehow, as well as to explain why that is. And that's because her feelings, her hopes, her beliefs, etc., just aren't at all guided by the person that he really is. So the Murdochian account of friendship vindicates this intuitive connection between her lack of knowledge and, as it turns out, her lack of love. It allows us to say that there's no true loving relationship between them because she's failing to really relate to Edward himself. That a failure to know the other person is a failure of friendship also makes sense of our intuitions about how a good friend would behave. So a person with mistaken beliefs about the other will lack an accurate vision of who the other person is and their kind of complex constellation of merits as well as flaws. And as such, I think they'd be likely to end up behaving in ways that are very uncharacteristic of friendship, since they won't be responsive to the actual features of the friend. So I think it's intuitive to think that the good friend will perceive your failures as such, sympathise with them, and help you out with the things you struggle with. But these actions are going to require in-depth and accurate knowledge of your limitations. And again, somebody who's a good friend will be unlikely to saddle you with responsibilities that you can't meet, and is likely to be well placed to offer you advice on what responsibilities you should accept. And all of these things are going to require a really accurate conception of your shortcomings and failings. So Keller suggests that goods of friendship like support and encouragement can be served by bias. But it seems like this account of friendship explains well why the good friend typically is well placed to offer advice and help you with certain things, because there looks like there are many, many goods characteristic of friendship that require knowledge of your failings. Taken together, I think these two considerations give good reason to think that a Murdochian account of friendship is at least plausible. It can explain why deep mistakes about a friend's character can detract from your friendship, and it can explain why certain actions are characteristic manifestations of friendship, whilst others are contrary to it. And so it provides this kind of unified explanation of why the particular actions and goods characteristic of friendship don't require epistemic bias. So I've outlined a Murdochian conception of friendship, which entails a rejection of the assumption that's gone unquestioned in most of the literature on epistemic partiality. The Murdochian conception suggests that the norms of epistemology and of friendship aren't independent of one another, since friendship involves knowledge, it involves epistemic goods. As such, on the Murdochian conception, there can't be constitutive conflict between the two. I haven't offered a kind of full defence of that conception of friendship, but I have suggested that it makes sense of our intuitions regarding the impact of importantly mistaken beliefs on friendships, and that it makes sense of the ways we'd expect a good friend to behave. I think this then gives us good reason to think that friendship is an epistemically rich state, and that discussions of epistemic partiality go awry in ignoring one of its core features.